The morning sun cast long shadows across the arid landscape of southern Arizona, where the Chiricahua Mountains stood like ancient sentinels against the pale blue sky. In a small clearing near the base of these weathered peaks, an elderly Apache man named Joseph Crowfeather knelt beside a pile of weathered wooden scraps, his weathered hands sorting through pieces that most people would consider worthless. Joseph had lived on this land for 73 years, watching it change from the traditional home of his ancestors to something caught between two worlds. His grandfather had told him stories of the old days, when the Apache moved freely across these mountains and valleys, building what they needed from the gifts the earth provided. Now, Joseph found himself struggling with a different kind of survival, one that required adapting to a world that seemed to have forgotten the old ways while demanding new solutions. The wooden scraps before him came from various sources around the reservation. Some pieces were from an old fence that had fallen during last winter's storms. Others came from construction projects in the nearby town, discarded materials that workers considered too small or damaged to use. Joseph had spent weeks collecting these fragments, seeing potential where others saw only waste. His current project was ambitious for someone working with such limited materials. Joseph needed to build a proper shelter for his granddaughter Maria's pottery workshop. Maria had recently graduated from college with a degree in art, and she wanted to return to the reservation to teach traditional Apache pottery techniques to the younger generation. However, she needed a workspace that could protect her materials from the harsh desert, whether while providing enough room for several students to work comfortably. Joseph had offered to build the workshop himself, remembering the construction techniques his own grandfather had taught him. But adapting those traditional methods to work with salvaged materials proved more challenging than he had anticipated. The wooden pieces were all different sizes. Many were warped from age and weather, and some had nails or screws that needed to be carefully removed to avoid splitting the wood. As he worked that morning, Joseph's frustration grew with each piece he examined. A board that looked promising from one angle revealed a crack running through its center when he turned it over. Another piece, perfect in length, had rotted sections that would make it unsuitable for structural use. The pile seemed to mock his efforts, as if the wood itself was resistant to his plans. The desert heat was already beginning to build, even though it was still early morning. Joseph paused to wipe the sweat from his forehead, looking out across the landscape that had shaped his people for generations. In the distance, he could see the dust cloud of a vehicle approaching along the dirt road that connected his property to the main highway. Visitors were rare in this remote area, and Joseph wondered who might be coming to see him. The vehicle, a pickup truck that had seen better days, pulled to a stop near Joseph's small house. From behind the wheel emerged a man Joseph recognized but had never formally met. Tom Bradley was a local rancher whose property bordered the reservation lands. Joseph had seen him occasionally at the feed store in town, and had heard neighbors speak of him with a mixture of respect and wariness that often characterized relationships between the Apache community and their non-native neighbors. Tom Bradley was a man in his late 50s, with the sun-weathered skin and practical demeanor of someone who had spent his entire life working the land. His family had owned the Bradley Ranch for 3 generations, running cattle across thousands of acres of high desert country. Like many ranchers in the area, Tom had built his relationship with the neighboring Apache community on a foundation of mutual respect and practical cooperation, understanding that good neighbors were essential for survival in such a demanding environment. As Tom approached, Joseph stood up slowly, his joints protesting after the morning spent crouched over the wood pile. The two men nodded to each other in the understated way that marked acknowledgement between people who understood the value of few words and genuine actions. "Morning, Joseph," Tom said, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of breathing desert air. "I was driving by and saw you working. Looks like you've got quite a project going." Joseph gestured toward the scattered wood pieces. "Trying to build a workshop for my granddaughter. She wants to teach pottery to the kids, but I need to make a proper building first." He paused, looking at the inadequate materials spread before him. "These scraps are all I can find, but they're not cooperating with my plans." Tom studied the wood pile with the practiced eye of someone who had built countless structures over the years. He could see immediately what Joseph was up against. The materials were insufficient for any substantial construction project, and many pieces were in poor condition. Yet Tom also recognized the determination in the older man's posture and the careful way he had organized even these inadequate materials. "That's important work," Tom said, thinking of his own and the value of preserving cultural knowledge. Teaching the traditional skills to young people, we need more of that. He looked again at the wood scraps, then back at Joseph. How big a workshop are you planning? Joseph walked Tom around the area where he intended to build, describing his vision for the space. As they talked, Tom began to understand the scope of the project and the significant gap between what Joseph needed and what he had available to work with. The conversation revealed not just the practical challenges of the construction project, but also the deeper significance of what Joseph was trying to accomplish for his community. The morning sun climbed higher as the two men continued their discussion, neither yet realizing that this chance encounter would mark the beginning of something larger than either had initially imagined. Tom Bradley stood in the morning heat, listening as Joseph Crowfeather described his granddaughter's dreams and the challenges of bringing them to reality. As a rancher who had worked with his hands his entire life, Tom could appreciate both the ambition of the project and the fundamental problem with the available materials. Maria studied art in college, Joseph continued, his voice carrying the pride of a grandfather discussing his accomplished granddaughter. But she wants to come back here and teach the old ways of making pottery. The clay from these mountains has been used by our people for hundreds of years. She says the young ones need to learn these traditions before they're lost completely. Tom nodded, understanding the importance of preserving knowledge that connected people to their land and heritage. His own family had ranching traditions that stretched back 3 generations, and he knew how easy it was for practical skills to disappear when younger generations moved to cities and different ways of life. As they talked, Tom examined the wood scraps more carefully. Some pieces showed promise, but many were too damaged, too small, or too warped to serve as reliable building materials. Joseph had clearly spent considerable time collecting and sorting these fragments, but the reality was that they simply weren't adequate for constructing a proper workshop. This pottery teaching, Tom asked, genuinely curious. How many students would Maria be working with? She hopes to start with maybe 8 or 10 kids from the community, Joseph replied. But if it goes well, maybe more. The tribal council is interested in supporting traditional arts programs. They think it might help keep young people connected to their culture instead of always moving away to the cities. Tom thought about this as he looked around Joseph's property. The land was beautiful in the stark way of the high desert, with views stretching for miles across valleys punctuated by ancient mountains. It seemed like an ideal place for young people to learn about their heritage while working with their hands to create something meaningful. The workshop would need to be pretty substantial then, Tom observed. Space for students to work, storage for materials and tools, protection from the weather during monsoon season. Joseph's expression showed both hope and concern. Yes, that's what Maria says, but building something that size with what I have here. He gestured toward the scrap wood pile with obvious frustration. I keep thinking I can make it work, but every time I try to plan it out, I come up short. Tom spent the next hour walking around Joseph's property with him, discussing the specifics of what the workshop would need. Joseph showed him where he planned to locate the building, taking advantage of natural windbreaks and the best morning light. His planning was thoughtful and practical, based on decades of understanding how to work with the desert environment. The conversation revealed that Joseph's challenges went beyond just the scarcity of good building materials. He was working entirely alone on the project, and while his knowledge of traditional construction methods was extensive, adapting those techniques to modern needs while using salvaged materials created complications he hadn't anticipated. I promised Maria I'd have it ready when she finishes her degree program this spring, Joseph said, a note of worry creeping into his voice. She's been planning this for 2 years, talking to the tribal education committee, getting everything organized. I don't want to be the reason her dream doesn't happen. Tom understood the weight of that responsibility. Family commitments and community projects often carried significance far beyond their immediate practical purpose. Joseph wasn't just building a workshop. He was supporting his granddaughter's efforts to preserve and share important cultural knowledge. As they stood looking at the proposed building site, Tom found himself thinking about his own workshop back at the ranch. Over the years, he had accumulated building materials from various projects, and he knew he had lumber that was going unused. His grandfather had taught him that good neighbors helped each other when they could, and that practical assistance was often more valuable than words of encouragement. Joseph, Tom said after a few minutes of consideration, I might have some materials back at the ranch that could help with this project. Nothing fancy, but solid lumber that's been properly stored. Would you be interested in taking a look at what I have?" Joseph turned to study Tom's face, trying to read the motivation behind the offer. Relationships between the Apache community and local ranchers had improved significantly over the years, but Joseph's generation still remembered times when such relationships were more complicated. However, Tom's demeanor suggested genuine interest in helping rather than any ulterior motive. "That's generous of you to offer," Joseph replied carefully. "But I should tell you straight that I don't have money to pay for materials right now. Everything I have is going toward the tools and supplies Maria will need for her teaching." Tom waved away the concern. "I'm not talking about selling anything. I've got lumber that's just sitting in storage, left over from projects I finished months or years ago. It's not doing anyone any good just sitting there. If it can help get this workshop built, that seems like a better use for it." The offer was unexpected, and Joseph found himself uncertain how to respond. On one hand, he desperately needed proper building materials to make Maria's workshop a reality. On the other hand, accepting such significant help from someone he barely knew felt complicated in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Tom seemed to sense Joseph's hesitation. "Tell you what," he said, "why don't you come by the ranch this afternoon and see what I have available? No commitment either way. If there's something useful there, we can figure out the details. If not, at least you'll know." As they continued talking, Joseph began to share more about his own background and the cultural significance of what Maria wanted to accomplish. He described the traditional Apache pottery techniques that had been passed down through generations, and how the specific clays and natural materials from their ancestral lands created pottery with distinctive characteristics that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Tom listened with the attention of someone who understood the connection between place and tradition. His own family's ranching practices had been adapted over generations to work specifically with the soil, climate, and geography of their particular piece of the desert. He recognized the parallel between his agricultural traditions and Joseph's cultural ones. The morning conversation stretched longer than either man had initially planned, but both seemed to find value in the exchange of ideas and perspectives. By the time Tom prepared to leave, they had moved from strangers who nodded politely when their paths crossed in town to neighbors who understood something significant about each other's lives and priorities. As Tom climbed back into his pickup truck, he looked once more at the scrap wood pile and the determined but worried expression on Joseph's face. The workshop project represented more than just a building. It was about preserving knowledge, supporting family, and maintaining connections between generations. Those were values Tom respected deeply, regardless of cultural differences. That afternoon, Joseph Crowfeather drove his weathered pickup truck along the dirt roads that led to the Bradley Ranch, wrestling with mixed feelings about accepting help from someone he barely knew. The landscape rolled by outside his windows, familiar territory that had shaped his understanding of self-reliance and community responsibility throughout his 73 years. The Bradley Ranch sprawled across several thousand acres of high desert country, with the main buildings nestled in a valley that provided some protection from the fierce winds that swept across the open range. As Joseph approached the ranch headquarters, he could see the evidence of 3 generations of careful stewardship in the well-maintained fences, the strategically placed windbreaks, and the buildings that had been constructed to work with rather than against the demanding environment. Tom Bradley emerged from a large barn as Joseph parked his truck near the main house. The rancher's easy manner helped ease some of Joseph's uncertainty about the visit, though questions about motivation and obligation continued to occupy his thoughts. "Glad you decided to come take a look," Tom said as he approached. "I've been thinking about what you need for that workshop, and I'm pretty sure I have some materials that would work well for your project." Tom led Joseph toward a large storage building that served as the ranch's supply depot. Inside, Joseph saw an impressive collection of building materials, tools, and equipment that Tom had accumulated over years of ranch maintenance and improvement projects. The organization was practical rather than neat, with materials sorted by type and potential use rather than appearance. "Most of this comes from projects where I ordered more than I ended up needing," Tom explained as they walked through the storage area. "Or jobs where we changed plans partway through and had materials left over. My grandfather always said it was better to have too much than too little when you're building something important." In one section of the building, Tom showed Joseph a stack of dimensional lumber that had been properly stored and protected from weather. The wood was straight, dry, and of much higher quality than anything Joseph could have obtained from salvaged materials. There was enough lumber to frame a substantial building, along with additional materials for siding, roofing, and interior finishing. Joseph ran his hands along the smooth boards, appreciating their quality while struggling with the implications of accepting such valuable materials. His practical side recognized that this lumber would solve his construction problems completely, allowing him to build the kind of workshop Maria needed for her pottery teaching. However, his pride and sense of independence made him uncomfortable with the idea of accepting such significant help. "This is good wood," Joseph said, his voice carrying both appreciation and concern. "But it's worth a lot of money. I can't just take materials like this without giving you something in return." Tom had anticipated this response, understanding that few people would feel comfortable accepting valuable gifts from near strangers. "I've been thinking about that too," he said. "What if we work out some kind of trade arrangement? I could use help with some projects around the ranch that require more skill than muscle. I'm good at the heavy work, but there are some Finnish carpentry jobs that need someone with experience in traditional building methods." The suggestion intrigued Joseph. Throughout his life, he had learned various construction techniques from Apache elders who understood how to create structures that could withstand the desert's extremes while using minimal materials efficiently. These skills combined traditional knowledge with practical innovation, and Joseph recognized that they might indeed be valuable to someone like Tom who appreciated quality craftsmanship. "What kind of work are you thinking about?" Joseph asked. Tom led him to several areas around the ranch where he had projects that required more sophisticated carpentry skills than he possessed. There was a historic adobe house that needed window frames rebuilt using traditional joinery methods. The ranch's original bunkhouse needed interior finishing work that would preserve its authentic character while making it suitable for modern use. Several outbuildings needed repairs that went beyond basic maintenance. As they discussed these projects, Joseph began to see how his skills and Tom's materials could create a mutually beneficial arrangement. The work Tom needed would challenge Joseph's abilities in interesting ways, while providing a dignified means of earning the lumber necessary for Maria's workshop. "I could start with the adobe house windows," Joseph suggested. "That's the kind of work I learned from my grandfather. He worked on some of the old Spanish mission buildings when he was younger before he taught me the techniques." Tom's face showed genuine interest. "That would be perfect. I've been trying to figure out how to restore those windows properly for 2 years. The originals were beautiful, but they're too damaged to repair, and modern replacements just don't look right in that building." As they continued touring the ranch and discussing potential projects, both men began to relax into what felt like a natural working partnership. Joseph's initial concerns about charity or hidden obligations gave way to recognition that Tom was offering a straightforward trade of skills for materials. The afternoon conversation also revealed shared values that transcended cultural differences. Both men had deep connections to the land they lived on, understood the importance of preserving traditional knowledge, and believed in the value of work that created lasting benefit for future generations. "My granddaughter Maria should meet your family sometime," Joseph suggested as they returned to where his truck was parked. "She's interested in learning about all the different ways people have adapted to living in this desert country. Your family's ranching knowledge might give her ideas for her pottery teaching." Tom's expression showed enthusiasm for the suggestion. "My wife Ellen would love that. She's been working on a book about the history of the families who settled in this area. She'd be fascinated to hear about the traditional Apache pottery techniques and how they connect to the local clay deposits." As Joseph prepared to leave, they worked out the practical details of their arrangement. Joseph would begin work on the adobe house windows within the week, using traditional joinery methods to create frames that would be both historically accurate and functionally superior to modern alternatives. In exchange, Tom would deliver the lumber needed for the pottery workshop to Joseph's property. The drive back to his own land gave Joseph time to process what had developed during the afternoon. What had begun as a desperate search for building materials had evolved into something more complex and potentially more valuable. He had found not just the lumber needed for Maria's workshop, but also a working relationship with a neighbor whose skills and resources complemented his own. Most importantly, The arrangement preserved his dignity while solving his practical problems. Instead of accepting charity, he would be trading his craftsmanship for materials, creating value for both parties while maintaining the self-reliance that had always been central to his character. As the sun set behind the Chiricahua Mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and red, Joseph felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in months. The workshop project, which had seemed increasingly impossible with each day he struggled with inadequate materials, now appeared achievable through honest cooperation with an unexpected ally. 3 weeks later, the desert morning air carried the sounds of construction as Joseph Crow Feather and Tom Bradley worked together to raise the frame of Maria's pottery workshop. The pile of scrap wood that had once represented Joseph's frustration and determination now sat to one side, repurposed as material for interior shelving and work surfaces, while Tom's lumber provided the strong foundation and walls the building required. The partnership had proven more productive than either man had initially anticipated. Joseph's work on the adobe house windows had revealed a level of traditional craftsmanship that impressed Tom deeply. The window frames Joseph created using traditional Apache joinery techniques were not only beautiful, but also superior to modern alternatives in their ability to withstand the desert's extreme temperature variations and seasonal winds. As they worked on the workshop construction, the two men had developed an easy rhythm of collaboration. Joseph's understanding of traditional building methods combined effectively with Tom's knowledge of modern materials and techniques, creating approaches to construction problems that neither could have solved alone. "Maria called last night," Joseph said as he positioned a roof beam while Tom prepared to secure it from below. "She's excited about coming home next month. The Tribal Education Committee has approved funding for her pottery program, and she already has 15 young people signed up for classes." Tom smiled as he guided the beam into position. "Ellen's been working on that book chapter about traditional crafts in the area. She'd love to include some information about Apache pottery techniques if Maria would be willing to share some of the cultural background." The workshop was taking shape as more than just a simple building. Joseph had incorporated design elements that reflected traditional Apache architecture while meeting the practical needs of pottery instruction. The building's orientation took advantage of morning light while providing protection from afternoon heat. Natural ventilation systems would keep the workspace comfortable even during the intense summer months. Tom had contributed suggestions based on his experience with buildings that needed to withstand the desert's harsh conditions. His recommendations for foundation design and roof construction would ensure the workshop could survive the flash floods and powerful winds that occasionally swept through the area. As they worked, both men had begun to see their collaboration as something that extended beyond the immediate project. Joseph's traditional knowledge and Tom's modern resources created possibilities for additional projects that could benefit both the Apache community and the broader region. "I've been thinking about something," Tom said during a break as they sat in the shade of the partially completed workshop. "The tribal council mentioned they're interested in developing traditional arts programs. Would there be interest in other kinds of traditional building projects? My ranch has some historic structures that could use restoration work, and I'd be happy to provide materials for community projects in exchange for the kind of craftsmanship you bring to the work." Joseph considered the suggestion carefully. The pottery workshop had demonstrated that cooperation between Apache traditional knowledge and Anglo resources could create results that benefited everyone involved. Similar partnerships might indeed support other cultural preservation efforts while providing meaningful work opportunities for community members. "There are several elders who have knowledge of traditional building methods," Joseph replied, "and some younger people who would like to learn these skills. If we could create more projects like this one, it might help keep that knowledge alive while giving young people practical skills they could use." As the day progressed, other community members began stopping by to see the workshop construction. Maria's aunt brought lunch for the workers and stayed to discuss her own ideas for traditional craft programs. Several teenagers from the community offered to help with the simpler construction tasks, eager to learn building skills while contributing to a project that would benefit their peers. The workshop construction had become a gathering point for conversations about broader community development possibilities. People began discussing other traditional arts that could be taught alongside pottery, and ways to connect cultural education with practical skills training that might create economic opportunities for young people who wanted to stay in the community. Tom found himself increasingly involved in these conversations, offering insights about the practical aspects of developing sustainable programs while learning about Apache cultural values that emphasized community benefit over individual profit. His own family's history in the area had given him appreciation for the importance of maintaining connections to place and tradition, values that aligned well with Apache approaches to community development. By late afternoon, the workshop frame was complete, and the building was beginning to look like the vision Joseph and Maria had originally discussed. The structure was solid and practical, designed to serve its educational purpose while reflecting the cultural values it would help preserve and transmit. As the sun set behind the mountains, Joseph and Tom stood back to admire their day's work. The workshop represented more than successful completion of a construction project. It symbolized the possibility of cooperation that honored different traditions while creating something new and valuable. "Maria will be home in 2 weeks," Joseph said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a grandfather whose promises to his family would be kept. "She'll be surprised to see how much more than just a building this has become." Tom nodded, understanding that the workshop had indeed become something larger than either of them had initially envisioned. The project had created new relationships, demonstrated the value of combining different types of knowledge, and established precedents for future cooperation between communities that had sometimes maintained cautious distance from each other. Over the following weeks, as they completed the workshop's interior finishing work, Joseph and Tom continued to develop their partnership. Joseph's traditional craftsmanship enhanced several of Tom's ranch restoration projects, while Tom's resources and modern knowledge supported additional community-building projects on the reservation. When Maria Crowfeather returned home from college and saw her completed pottery workshop, she immediately understood that her grandfather had created something much more significant than the workspace she had originally requested. The building itself was beautiful and functional, perfectly suited for its educational purpose. But more importantly, the project had created connections and established cooperation patterns that would support cultural preservation efforts for years to come. The first pottery class began on a warm spring morning, with 15 young Apache students gathering in the workshop to learn traditional techniques from Maria while working with clay that connected them to their ancestral lands. Joseph watched from a distance, satisfied that his struggle with inadequate materials had led to something far more valuable than he had originally hoped to build. The scrap wood pile, finally put to its intended use as interior shelving and work surfaces, no longer represented frustration and limitation. Instead, it had become part of a larger story about resourcefulness, cooperation, and the unexpected ways that community needs could be met when people were willing to share knowledge and resources across cultural boundaries. As the students began working with the ancient clay, learning techniques their ancestors had perfected over generations, the workshop fulfilled its purpose as a bridge between traditional knowledge and contemporary needs. The building stood as proof that with determination, cooperation, and mutual respect, even the most challenging projects could succeed beyond their creators' original dreams.